Welcome to the SOB radio show, where we have fun, interesting guests, and hot topics. Each week, we offer insights into music, fashion, health, fitness, and humor. Do you have the perfect guest for us to interview? I want to know. Drop me a line on our Facebook page at Spunky Old Broad 1 or reach out to me on our website at spunkyoldbroad.com. And now, back to the show. My guest today is Randi Fine. She's a 61-year-old dedicated pioneer in the narcissistic abuse movement and a narcissistic personality disorder abuse expert. She's a radio show host, author, and coach living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She's the co-owner with her husband of 2 Massage Envy franchises and has her own jewelry business on Etsy. Randi, you are a busy lady. How are you, and welcome.
Hi, Gayle. I am a busy lady, but I'm doing great. Thanks.
Well, I even had to ask Randi, listeners, if she was really 61, because she looks so good that I could not believe she was 61 years old. So whatever she's doing well, and she's doing right. However,
Thank you.
I have to say to you, I have never heard of narcissistic abuse. I mean, I thought I was pretty up on everything, but I know what narcissistic is and I know what abuse is, but I've just never heard of someone who is an expert in it. So explain to our listeners exactly what narcissistic abuse is.
Okay, well, you're in for a real treat because this is a fascinating topic. So when we think of narcissism, we think of people who are excessively into themselves, who boast how wonderful they are. What I'm talking about is people who have been victimized by those who have narcissistic personality disorder. And when I say disorder, so I'm talking about an actual disorder that is classified in the same group as psychopaths, sociopaths, borderline personality disorder, and people who have histrionic as well. So we're talking about empathy devoid human beings. And narcissists are predatory, parasitic human beings. They're very dangerous, but they're dangerous because not that they hurt people physically, but they burrow into our psyches. They get deep into our unconscious minds. And so anyone who has become, I call them hostages, many people call them relationships, but when you get involved with a narcissist or you are raised by one, the effects of brainwashing and mind control are huge. So it would be likened to somebody who has gotten into a cult. They're coaxed into it gradually, and before they know it, they're not thinking clearly. And so when you've been abused this way, whether it be from childhood, which I was, or through a romantic relationship, you develop something called narcissistic victim syndrome. And narcissistic victim syndrome has the following symptoms: depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, self-loathing, hopelessness, self-blaming, restlessness, avoidance behaviors, phobias, worry, unexplained body aches and symptoms, weight or eating issues, signs of physical abuse sometimes. And they describe themselves as empty and lonely and torn, confused, suicidal, unable to cope, seriously guilt-ridden. And they also are suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is PTSD that has gone on for a period of time. It's not one event. It is a stretched out exposure to these very, very cruel individuals.
So what does someone do? I mean, if they're brainwashed, if they're under someone's control, I don't know if this is something you get a restraining order against. I don't know if it takes a period of time before you recognize it. How do you keep these people away from you? I mean, what are some of the areas that happen because of this?
Okay. It takes people, first of all, if you've been raised, as I was, in a home with a narcissistic parent, generally what I find is survivors don't wake up until they're in their generally 40s or 50s, sometimes in their 60s.
Really? Wow, that's amazing.
Yes, because the abuse happens on a unconscious level. And what we know intellectually is not what we know emotionally. And we cannot get to that place inside of us. All we know is that things aren't working for us. Our life is falling apart. We've had terrible, very disastrous relationships. People who are in marriages or romantic relationships with these people, they are in a pattern of holding because they cannot believe that what they're thinking is true. Because nothing makes sense. Everything about this kind of abuse is counterintuitive, meaning that whatever one would think in any other normal relationship, it is the opposite with narcissistic abuse. So narcissists have this way, they have many tactics for keeping us under their thumb, for keeping us held down. And they use this one tactic, which is good, bad reinforcement, which means that they'll be abusive, emotionally abusive most of the time, but every once in a while they throw a crumb at you. And because you're so looking for that good person to come back to you, because that person was there in the beginning, they're imposters. They represent themselves as someone completely different. They check all the boxes of anyone that you would ever want in your life. And then the minute, there's always a pivotal moment, either when you move in with them, you get engaged, you get married, whatever it is, when they know they've got you, everything you knew about that person goes. And all of a sudden you are under extreme abuse and you can't do anything right. And you're being put down all the time. And but people who have gotten caught up in this kind of situation, they're believing that that person exists and they think it's them. They think that if they do this and they do that, maybe they'll get that person back. And they're being blamed for everything that's going wrong in the relationship. So it's very, very confusing. Eventually, some people wake up, some people do not. My father's been married to my mother for over 75 years, and he thinks she's the salt of the earth. He's like a puppet. He has no soul.
Wow.
So they steal.
Your mom was the one who was a narcissist.
My mother. And my parents are still alive, 91 and 96.
Wow.
She's still extremely abusive. And my father he has no self. He is just her puppet.
So let me ask you something, Randi. How old were you when you recognized this?
So I began feeling very uncomfortable at around 42. And all of a sudden, I could not stand the sound of my mother's voice, and I couldn't stand to be in her presence. And I had no idea why, because I was my mother's favorite. And she told me she loved me all the time. But the love that she had for me was very conditional, and I was objectified. So it wasn't the kind of love that a child would have where they know that they're loved inside and out, especially for who they are, not what they represent. For my mother, it was what I represented to her. And she had me trained to be, perfection was my thing, pleasing and perfection, because that's how I coped with the craziness of my childhood.
So do you have brothers and sisters? I mean, did they feel the same way?
Yes, I have two sisters who are older. My sisters, so there's narcissistic abuse can be covert or it can be overt. When it's overt, it's much easier to recognize because the narcissist is very vocal with what they think. When there's a covert narcissist, they are so subtle that you don't pick up on anything. They're so seamless in their ability to hide who they are. But the mechanisms that they use are so insidious and penetrating, and they change who you are. So for me, my adult life was a disaster when, instead of reaching adulthood and beginning to soar in life or kind of pick up and, go for a goal, I plummeted, which is very typical of those who have been raised in these environments. And then I had one horrific relationship after another. And I just thought that my life was just doomed, that my life would always be tough, and these people would keep coming into my lives. I had no idea what had happened to me. So around age 42, I finally couldn't stand being in my own skin, and I went to see a therapist. Now, the thing about therapy for this is not recognized by traditional psychiatrists and psychologists, and it does not respond to cognitive behavioral therapy. So most therapists don't recognize this, but what my therapist did recognize was that I had a severe boundary issue. I had no boundaries. And so she helped me work on that. She helped me build boundaries and start to set limits with my parents. And she offhandedly one day said to me, "Your mother sounds like a narcissist." Well, I didn't know. I thought, narcissist, okay, that's the typical feeling that, picture that we have of somebody who is narcissistic. And my mother was none of those things. She never boasted. In fact, she was the opposite of, she never praised herself. She always was very demure about those kind of things. And I couldn't put it together, but this was prior to the internet being out. And once the internet came out and I started, surfing around in it, and I looked up narcissism and I came across this thing, and it was like, oh my God, that's it. That's everything. It described everything.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, was how you honed your expertise when there was really none of this that was available. And I know that you're also, you're dedicated to this abuse movement, and you want to pave the way for others to find their way out of it. So how did you hone your expertise, and what is your goal, and how do you think you're going to get there?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for asking that, Gayle. I honed my expertise over a period of years. I really believe that, first of all, the first thing that one has to do when they're recovering from something like this is to come to full self-love, self-esteem, self-protection, self-validation, and a boundary system. And I recognized that those things were all lacking in my life. So I began building on those things little by little. I do believe that there was some kind of intervention, because generally one cannot heal from this alone. They must have help because of the brainwashing and mind control. The survivors are not thinking clearly, and they can't, as I said earlier, they can't meld what they know emotionally with what they feel, what they know intellectually with what they feel emotionally, and it drives people crazy because they can't do it. But somehow I was able to do it, and I really believe that it's because this is what I'm supposed to be doing in my life, and I was able to heal myself, and now I spend my life healing others.
So who do you coach, and how do they know about you?
I've been doing this for a very long time. I have a website. I have a podcast. I write extensively. I have a book out there. I write and I write and I write because I want this to get out there. First of all, I want to get picked up by Google so people when they begin to search, they know that this information is out there. But over the years, I've developed a worldwide following, and my blog is read in 180 countries. I coach, counsel people from all over the world. This is a problem that is epidemic. It is way more than anyone could possibly believe. These people walk among us silently, and they're predators and parasites, and they ruin lives. And so my goal is to get as much awareness out there, as well as heal anybody that I possibly can, bring people out of this. Because when people come out of it, they're empowered and they want to do more about this. So the more people I can reach, I want to expose these people. I want to put a red dot on every predator's forehead. So even though they walk invisibly among us, we know what to look for.
Well, that's so interesting. And you've got this podcast, which is called A Fine Time for Healing. Tell us about it. How often do you do it? How long is it? How many listeners do you have? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, sure. I would love to. A Fine Time for Healing, I've been doing it for over 9 years. I've amassed about 500 shows. I do shows twice a week. Now, A Fine Time for Healing is about physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological well-being. So I interview people who are experts in all these different aspects, and I really try to pick just really unique topics. And then I interview people. But once a month, I do a show where I take calls and answer questions about narcissistic abuse. And I call it Free Advice Friday. So my followers all know that the second Friday of the month is when I will have that show on, and they can call in for free and, and get advice. So I love doing this show because I learn so much. And I know, you have a podcast, so you understand what I'm saying. I get so much out of this because I learn from the people who have either had these incredible experiences or have this incredible knowledge, whatever it is. And I have, oh my gosh, I have hundreds of books here because I read every book for every person I have on.
So really, you're educating yourself at the same time as you're helping people, because different people present different situations to you. And each one is probably unique in its own way. And it's a way for you to be able to really build your knowledge base as well.
Exactly. I feel like I go to a university twice a week. I learn so much. And what's interesting is, these topics, they really range. But every topic I can bring back somehow to narcissistic abuse. It relates to almost every wellness topic out there because it affects us on every level, physically, emotionally, spiritually.
And you said that it wasn't really recognized at the time you started going to the therapist. Is it recognized now as something that is absolutely happening in our society, or is it still pretty closed off?
Narcissistic personality disorder is absolutely recognized in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual that all mental health professionals use for diagnosis. But the effects on the victims is not something that is recognized. So what I was talking about earlier, narcissistic victim syndrome, is not recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. So no one in the mental health field ever gets training or any exposure to this problem. It exists, but it is not recognized. And if you think about post-traumatic stress disorder, that did not become a diagnosis until not that long ago. So the American Psychiatric Association has to agree that this is something that is diagnosable before they'll put it in. And if it's not diagnosable, therapists and psychiatrists cannot diagnose it, which is why my therapist threw it out there, but she would never identify my mother that way because she didn't do the workup and and figure that out for herself. And they're not allowed to come up with a diagnosis that is not, that they have not worked up the patient, and it's not in the DSM-5. So this is something that out-of-the-box thinkers, psychologists who have had people come in, and some people have really woken up to the fact that this truly exists. And my book, Close Encounters of the Worst Kind, is being used by psychologists because it's teaching them how to deal with these people. And they also refer people to me.
That's interesting. So you've got this book, Close Encounters of the Worst Kind, and you have another one, Cliffedge Road.
Yes.
Tell us about them.
Okay. Close Encounters of the Worst Kind, the Narcissistic Abuse Survivor's Guide to Healing and Recovery, is actually the most comprehensive book on this topic out there. I cover every aspect of what narcissistic personality disorder is, how it looks, how it relates to psychopaths, sociopaths, other predators, because people often call their narcissist a sociopath or a psychopath because the behavior is so horrible. And so if you have one disorder in the cluster B personality disorders, which is the group I mentioned earlier, you will have aspects of others. So narcissists absolutely have aspects of psychopaths, sociopaths, histrionic, borderline. And likewise, people who are the antisocial personality disorders, sociopathy and psychopathy, they all have narcissistic traits. So there's a lot of crossovers. So I go into that. I talk about every possible relationship that you could have with a narcissist and exactly what it looks like. I start off every chapter with a case history so that people can see themselves in this particular situation. And this can affect, as I said, it can be a childhood thing, it can be a romantic thing, it's in corporate America, huge in corporate America and politics. It is in friendships. Many of us are experiencing this and don't know what it is because we have been taught when we were younger to look for the good in people and to give people the benefit of the doubt. And this is where we get caught by these people. There has to be a vulnerability that we have of some sort for them to be able to get in. And it could be anything. Sometimes, like I had one client who had been married for 30 some years. She had a wonderful marriage and she was grieving the loss of it. And so she was vulnerable to one of these predators. But anyway, I go into every relationship. I talk about exactly what narcissistic victim syndrome is, what all the signs and symptoms are. Then I talk about how to heal from this. And I have a chapter on boundaries, learning to love yourself, finding validation from within. The narcissistically abused have been taught that they're only as good as they're told they are. So they're trained not to self-validate. And as you can imagine, that would set somebody up, when you're constantly looking for people to tell you you're okay. Well, that doesn't look so good and it sets you up for failure. And then I talk about collateral damage because this causes eating disorders. It causes extreme empathic sensitivity.
But you know something, Randi, I want to break in here because we've only got about 2 minutes of this segment left.
Oh, sure.
But you mentioned friendship, and I'm not sure if somebody is a true friend, that they can be a true friend if they're a narcissist. And so, I question that because a true friend will usually do things for you with no ulterior motive, will give you advice with no ulterior motive, and do it out of the goodness of their heart. So it's hard for me to believe that a friendship will develop with somebody who is narcissistic. Now, it might with my knowing it, But if I am attuned to this at all, or if I recognize any of these things, I would think that this person would not be my friend. So, I mean, that's just something I'm thinking about here before we go to our break.
Right.
You know,
Would you like me to speak to that?
yeah, but you have to do it in like a minute.
Okay, I can do it in a minute. Perfect. People who are lacking in self-esteem, self-validation, things like that, get into friendships with people who use them. There are plenty of people out there who are users. But when you're a good person, as I was starting to say before, and you look for the best in people, you don't ever want to judge someone. So there are plenty of people out there having friendships that are not two-sided. They don't go both ways. They're very one-sided. But people are looking for the potential and the possibility, and they don't want to believe anybody could be this cruel.
Wow. Well, folks, we're going to take a break here, and we'll be back with Randi Fine, who is an expert in the narcissistic abuse movement, and she's an expert in this arena, and we'll be back with her shortly.